She stepped off the train with dust on the hem of her dress and no story she could safely tell. A young girl from Indian Territory, maybe 15, likely younger. No one asked. No one cared. Not in a place like Abilene. In the fall of 1897, the cotton harvest was underway. Steam hissed from the train behind her. Wagons creaked under the weight of heavy bales of cotton. The smell of dry earth tangled with the scent of sawdust, tobacco, horses, and sweat. She clutched a small sack, not much in it, a tin comb, perhaps a length of ribbon, a folded calico dress for Sundays, if there were Sundays. She might have been traveling with a stepbrother. That's what the family story says. But his name is now gone, a casualty of time and memory. What we do know is that they came from the north, likely from Chickasaw or Choctaw country, possibly riding the Katy line through Denison and maybe Fort Worth, then transferring to the Texas and Pacific Railway headed west. That line ran just south of Jones County near Anson, Texas, and that's where she likely got off. Not with a plan, just with intent. They checked around town, asked for work, finding a farm several miles away that was still hiring. No paper trail for this part, no ticket stubs, no manifests, no journals and diaries, none that I've found. But there doesn't need to be, because Henrietta wasn't alone. Thousands of native and mixed heritage families, along with formerly enslaved freedmen, were leaving Indian Territory during this time. Railroads made it all possible. Texas cotton made it necessary. The 1890s were a time of movement, of survival and transformation. In the years after the American Civil War and the reorganization of tribal lands, Indian Territory saw a growing class of landless workers, people displaced by policy, poverty, or both. And the farms of Texas, especially on the prairie, were hungry for cheap labor. Entire families would ride south by wagon or trail, work the fields during harvest time in the fall, and then drift back north again. Others, like Henrietta, well, they stayed. Why not? Whether by choice or circumstance, they put down roots in unfamiliar soil. There's something important in that. She wasn't just a girl on a train. She was part of a much bigger story, a quiet migration, largely undocumented, often unspoken, but vital. A story of indigenous women moving through the shadows of American history, trying to survive in a country that never made space for them. And in that space between departure and arrival, between Indian Territory and West Texas, Henrietta met fate. By March of 1898, she was pregnant. In December, she gave birth to a son, John W. Henderson. And the man who fathered him? Well, that was Charlie. He didn't find her, she found him. And the rest, well, the rest gets harder to explain. Her name was Henrietta Waters, or at least that's the name we've traced through the records. But in truth, the records don't tell us much. There's no birth certificate, no family records, no photograph from her youth. What we have is memory. And memory, in this family, tends to walk with a limp. Henrietta told her daughter-in-law, Irma, my grandmother, that she'd left behind a father and a half-sister on a reservation in Indian Territory. Her mother, she said, was already gone. Whether death took her or distance, we don't know. What we do know is that Henrietta came south as a teenager, likely in the fall of 1897, traveling with a stepbrother whose name has long since slipped through the cracks. She told Irma that she came to pick cotton. In the years after the Civil War, and especially after the opening of Oklahoma Territory in 1889, waves of native and mixed heritage laborers left Indian Territory each fall to follow the harvest into Texas. And most came from Chickasaw and Choctaw country. Their tribal governments weakened, their land holdings eroded, and their futures uncertain. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, known as the Katy Line, connected Denison just across the Red River to Dallas and Fort Worth. From there, the Texas and Pacific Railway stretched westward, skimming just below Jones County, where we know Charlie's father, R.A., had established land. Henrietta likely disembarked near Abilene, then traveled overland to Anson, where farms and rail work promised short-term wages, but little else. She wasn't alone. She was part of a mass, mostly invisible migration. Indigenous women working the fields, living in camps, moving through towns that didn't bother to remember their names. When the 1900 census was taken, Henrietta listed herself as white. She also lied about her age, adding a few years to make her relationship with Charlie appear less scandalous. She may have been just 15 or 16 when she got pregnant, maybe younger, but you wouldn't know that from the page. On record, she's older, settled, respectable. That's one thing about survival. It doesn't always leave room for the truth. She passed, or tried to. In 1900s Texas, being a native woman was dangerous. It meant lower wages. It meant harsher judgment. Sometimes it meant violence. So Henrietta did what many women like her did. She blended in, told just enough truth to get by, and kept the rest folded up like a letter in her apron pocket. Even her family didn't know the whole story. But here's what they did remember. She was strong. She was tall. Granny used to say, and she wasn't just tall, she was big. And she looked just like an old Indian woman. That's a quote. She carried her weight like a shield, her silence like armor. In the brief chapters where her story intersects with Charlie's, she becomes more than just a name on a page. She becomes a force, not loud, not boastful, but anchored. And maybe that's why she stayed, even after he left. He was just a farm boy, working land that didn't belong to him, living under the roof of a father who rarely stayed in one place. She was the new girl in the fields, barely 15, 16, possibly younger, her hands raw from picking, her hair covered in a rag to block the sun. She might have arrived only days earlier, maybe weeks, moving through Texas like the season itself, sudden, necessary, and unnoticed. We don't know how they met, but we can guess. Maybe they passed each other near the edge of a field where Charlie's father had leased land outside of Anson. Maybe she brought water to a work crew. Maybe Charlie saw her at a general store or a church tent revival. Her face still marked with the red dust of travel. We'll never know if it was love, but We know it was real enough to leave a mark because in March of 1898, Henrietta got pregnant. In December, she gave birth to a baby boy, John W. Henderson. In a better world, or at least a more recorded one, we would have a marriage certificate. We don't. What we have is a boy born to two teenagers in a rural county during cotton season, and a census record 2 years later that pretends everything was just fine. By 1900, Charlie and Henrietta are listed as husband and wife, living in Fannin County with their 1-year-old son. He's 20. She claims to be 18. We know she wasn't. Henrietta likely lied to make the relationship appear proper. Maybe to protect herself, maybe to protect Charlie, maybe to keep the census man from asking questions she didn't feel like answering. Because here's the part that doesn't add up and maybe never will. Charlie appears in two places at once. If you've listened to my other podcasts, you've heard this story, but just in case you haven't, one census shows him living with Henrietta and their child in Fannin County, but another, taken around the same time in 1900, lists him in Stonewall County, living with his father, R.A., unmarried, no children, just a boy. You can call that a mistake, a duplicate, a clerical error, maybe a different person, but I know it wasn't. I can prove that they're the same person, but you'll have to watch my podcast to find out how. I don't think it was a clerical error. I think Charlie was managing appearances, telling different stories in different towns. And I think Henrietta played along. Because when you've already crossed a border, already erased your past, just to survive in a place that doesn't want you, a little more pretending doesn't cost much. Together, they started a new life in Texas, but already the foundation had cracks. Already, things weren't what they seemed, and still, somehow, they built a family. At least for a while. When the 1900 census taker came through, someone gave him answers. Not the truth, just answers. They were married, they said, had been for 2 years. Their son John was already 1, and on paper that was the story. But none of it fits. By all reasonable estimates, Henrietta was born around 1882 or 1883, which would make her younger when she got pregnant. And that lines up not just with the math, it lines up with memory. In the mid-1900s, I sat at a table with my dad and my Granny Henderson, Dad's mother. We were going over this exact moment in Henrietta's life, the age, the baby, the timeline that didn't quite add up. Granny insisted Henrietta had been just a girl. Granny said 13 or 14, and that's in 1900. And one of those conversations I happen to have recorded, and I still have it on tape here somewhere. The numbers, the story, her silence, they all start to make sense when you realize how young she really was. Charlie would have been 18, barely out of his father's house. Maybe they weren't married when John was born, not legally, and if they were joined in some quiet ceremony, the kind that left no record, no license or formal church entry has ever been found. Just the census line. Just names on a page. And one more thing, John W. Henderson, that middle initial W, it matters. Henrietta used that name, William, more than once for her children. Repeating a name isn't unusual in big families. But in this case, it feels intentional. Like she was honoring someone, or maybe remembering someone. A brother, a father, a name carried from Indian Territory to Texas. in the folds of a life that she rarely spoke about. The thing is, this wasn't the only version of Charlie that year. Remember, in Stonewall County, about 175 miles away, another census taker filled out another form, and there was Charlie, again listed single, living with his father, no wife, no child, 2 places, 2 stories, the same man. Charlie gave the government what they expected, a respectable version of himself, someone whose life fit into the boxes and categories, and Henrietta did the same. 2 people already learning how to edit their lives for survival. That double listing is where the myth begins to split, where Charlie, the man I'd grow up hearing stories about, becomes 2 Charlies. The bachelor and the husband. The one who stayed home and the one who disappeared. And Henrietta? She's right there in the middle of it, wearing a name that may not be hers, living a life that starts to vanish even as it's written down. Last week we talked about a baby lost to time. She was born in Ratcliffe, Texas in 1912, a girl, unnamed on the certificate. The document simply reads, Baby Henderson, born to Henrietta Waters and Charlie Henderson. Charlie is misspelled as Charley. There's no N in the name. Charlie always put Charlie in or Charles in or Chaz on one occasion in, but there was always an N. I have his signature, and the N is very unique, and it's not on this page, but it looks like his handwriting. One of the few surviving pieces of paper where Henrietta's maiden name appears. And likely one of the last moments Henrietta and Charlie were still in the same story. There's no death certificate, no cemetery record for the baby. She's not listed in the 1920 census. She's never mentioned in family trees, and just one fragile record, and then nothing but silence. Last week, I speculated that maybe the baby had been adopted, that maybe Henrietta, abandoned and desperate, handed her off to another family. A quiet act of survival rather than sorrow, but I compared the signatures. It looks like Charlie's handwriting. So he probably was there. One of the last times he was there. That speculation about adoption, that was me being hopeful. Me trying to soften a story that has too much grief baked into its bones. But then I went back and listened to Granny's voice captured on tape decades ago. And that old recording, she's talking with me and my dad. Her old turn of the 20th century Kentucky drawl is a little hard to understand if you didn't grow up with it. We're sitting around the kitchen table puzzling over dates, trying to line up Henrietta's timeline, and almost as an afterthought, she says it. It's a line I didn't remember until I went back and listened to the tape. She said Henrietta had a baby girl, and she died. She didn't live very long at all. Granny thought the baby was from Henrietta's second marriage, a Mercer baby, but that detail is wrong. The part that stuck, though, the part she remembered, the baby died. Granny's voice echoed down through the decades and confirmed what I had been too soft to say. The baby never made it. She was born in the middle of Charlie's plans to stage his death, born in the smoke left behind by a man who walked out the door and never came back. She may have been buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near Ratcliffe, or perhaps beneath those pines, tall and proud. outside a logging camp in East Texas. Wrapped in a blanket, Henrietta stitched herself. There is no record, no gravestone, just an ache. Henrietta never spoke of her again, not to Granny, not to her sons, not to anyone who was listening. Sometimes grief is so deep, it folds itself into silence. That's what happened here. A daughter born, a husband vanished, and a line in the family story that simply disappears. After 1912, Charlie's trail goes cold and Henrietta's grows quiet. He was gone and she was still standing. In the space of a few months, she'd buried a baby and lost a husband, if not to death, then to desertion. And even though no grave was dug for Charlie, the man she once loved and had married had vanished. Vanished in a way that only men like Charlie could, like smoke curling from a fire that she hadn't meant to light. She didn't talk much about what happened after that, but she didn't quit either. She stayed in Houston County a while longer, raising her sons as best as she could. She cooked, she cleaned, she endured. By 1920, she'd moved to Polk County and remarried. The name on the census was different now, Henrietta Mercer. The children still bore Charlie's name, but on the census, everybody had Mercer after their name, as if Mr. Mercer was their father. He was listed as the head of household. But the man behind Charlie's name was gone, swallowed up by East Texas pine and whatever shame or fear kept him from coming back. She had one more child with her second husband, a half-brother to the rest, but she never spoke much about Mr. Mercer either, just enough to get by. For many decades, his first name was lost to time. All we knew was his last name was Mercer. Granny remembered Henrietta not as a fragile woman, but as a presence. She said she was big and strong and carried herself like someone who had survived too much to be bothered by nonsense. She wore her past like layers, thick, quiet, practical. Henrietta didn't explain herself, didn't ask permission. And then when she told stories, they came out in slivers. Never the whole thing, just enough to remind you that she had seen things that you hadn't. Henrietta died in 1938 from cancer in a hospital. She's buried in Peebles Cemetery in Polk County, Texas. There's a headstone, but no long obituary, no family Bible entry to explain what she endured, just a name and a date. A name carved in granite, and the stories that got passed down in whispers. She lived another 25 years after Charlie disappeared, but she never filed for anything. No missing persons report, no legal petition, no real explanation. It's possible that she believed the story, that Charlie had fallen under a train, buried by the tracks. It's also possible that she knew better, but if she did, she never said so. Not to my granny. Henrietta lived a full life, not by volume, but by weight, and she did so while the world mostly forgot about her. But we didn't, because she's the reason this story exists. She's the reason Charlie's shadow still matters. She didn't run. She didn't vanish. She stayed. That's it for this episode of Finding Grandpa Charlie. This week, we followed the footsteps of a girl from Indian Territory, a cotton picker, a mother, a widow in everything but law, and a woman whose silence held more truth than most people's stories, Henrietta Waters Henderson Mercer. She didn't leave much behind, at least not on paper, but if you listen closely, her life still echoes in the names she gave her children, in the lies she had to tell to survive, and in the legacy that lives on in us. If you've been enjoying this journey, I'd love for you to follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone who loves a good mystery with a little heart behind it. If you're curious about what's coming next, well, it gets messier from here. The more I research, guys, the more questions I get. One answer leads to 3 more questions, more mysteries. Next time, Charlie learned to be a drifter first from his father, who moved through the counties of East Texas like a blowing wind, always looking for the next opportunity. And we'll explore the history of the Henderson family from Fannin County all the way into East Texas. Until then, this is Finding Grandpa Charlie. I'm Irv Lindsay. Thanks for listening.